This is Nancy Blaze conducting an interview for the Washington State Jewish Archives Committee of David Fine in Seattle, Washington on Monday, November 10th, 2014. David, thank you very much for taking the time for this oral history. Would you please spell and pronounce your name?
Sure. My complete whole full name is David Joel, Joel, Burstein, Burstein. Last name is Fine, as in things are just fine, Fine.
When and where were you born, please?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan, at New Grace Hospital on October the 16th of 1956.
Would you please provide the names of grandparents and parents and where they grew up and moved to? If their names are unusual, would you please spell them? And if you could describe your family, your parents, and siblings.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So I was fortunate enough to get to know all four of my grandparents. My mother's parents were Samuel and Minnie, Minnie, Smolnick, Smolnick. Interestingly enough, my mother's father was born in the States, in Detroit, and her mother was born, but it was certainly in Europe. Could be Sebastopol, we're not quite sure, somewhere in the Ukraine. She came over when she was about 6 years old. My father's parents are Minnie, again Minnie. Her maiden name was Shelansky, Shelansky, and Abraham, although as he was known to others, just the initial M, Abraham Fine. He was born actually in Burlington, Vermont. And there's a whole story there. My father's mother, likely born upstate New York, close to, if not in, Glens Falls, New York. My wife likes to tease me because my family has been here so long. My father's father was the first Jewish wedding in Vermont. And another little interesting fact, my father's mother, his paternal grandmother, lived to be 106 and was the oldest person in Dade County when she died. My family, I grew up in suburban Detroit in Oak Park, Michigan, which was a very Jewish suburb. It was the first ring. It was immediately north of 8 Mile. The schools were all closed on Jewish holidays. As much for business reasons, there just weren't teachers or students who were going to be in class, as it was to honor Jewish holidays. My family, my mother is Frances Gwendolyn Smolnick, and my father, F-R-A-N-C, Gwendolyn, right? It's quite a name, Fredel Genendel. And
would you spell that, please?
Smolnick, Smolnick. And my father is Harland, Harland, Harland Willard Fine. He's Herschel Velvel, though, to all who know him. Actually, he's known as Sonny, Sonny, because his mother said no one should have to call a 3-year-old Harland Willard, even though she gave him that name. I have a brother and a sister. My brother is Robert, who lives in suburban Minneapolis. My sister is Sharon and Sarah Ruchel, Sharon Ruth, and she lives in suburban Detroit to this day, where my parents live as well.
Would you spell Sharon's last name?
Sharon's Sharon, Sharon, Ruth, Ruth, Fine, Fine.
Oh.
But she married Sarah Ruchel is her Yiddish.
Oh.
Yeah, that's how she. Yeah.
How would you spell that?
Sarah Ruchel. I think I would probably spell it still Sarah, but Ruchel might be Ruchel.
Okay.
My brother is Ruvain Baruch. So in that, I have my complete Jewish name. And what's striking, because and my son's going to be giving a sermon on this actually about change. I was ordained in 1989 at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. He was then 2.5 years old. What that meant, though, is that his Jewish name changed when I became a rabbi. It's the only way you can get your Jewish name to change. He is Avishai. He was Avishai ben David Ubatami, and his name became Avishai ben Harav David Uvatami. I am David Yehuda. It's my full Jewish name.
And how do you spell that?
David Yehuda, Yehudah. I am one of 3 people. My father's maternal grandfather. All of us became rabbis.
Oh.
And
Yeah.
at the bris they said his name was David Yudi, but the Moyle wisely said there's no such name Yudi, it's Yehuda.
Okay. And what involvement, if any, did your family have with the Jewish community?
We always belonged to Temple Israel in Detroit. It's now one of the largest, if not the largest, Reform congregation in North America, at over 3,000 households. She began teaching preschool,
Your mother?
my mother, at that congregation. And though my mother never belonged to a congregation growing up. She played in the synagogue and in the alley behind the synagogue, but they never belonged. She figured that if she taught pre-kindergarten, she would know more than those kids, and perhaps actually know more than Reform Jewish families. Striking now that here her son's become a rabbi, and her grandson, my son, is on his way to becoming a rabbi. He's in his first year of rabbinical school. So we were very involved in the congregation, very involved in youth group, and that actually had a significant impact on my decision to become a rabbi. We also, my mother taught religious school, driving. Well, she always drove. It wasn't even a carpool. She just drove. And we'd have many a religious conversation during those car rides. In particular, she would turn on broadcasts of Christian religious services so she could point out how Jews and Christians are different.
Very interesting.
It really was.
Yes. Would you talk about your years growing up in terms of high school and your college years? Not including the religious school.
Including or not? No.
No, the
So that's the secular. So I went to Oak Park High School, a public high school. It was always ranked very high in the state, one of the top 2 or 3 schools for academics. I really enjoyed high school. I was a swimmer in high school. I was the captain of my high school swim team. And we were known actually for losing rather than winning. We lost 69 swim meets in a row. It was quite an event. My senior year, we were 2-14. I remember the date, January the 19th of 1974, when we won our first swim meet against Hazel Park. So I remember it well. Again, a fairly, was it large? I want to say 400 to 500 members of each class. It was still a growing community when I graduated high school in 1974. When it came time for college, really just thought about public institutions. The idea of a private school just seemed way too far away, economically and otherwise. I think my parents were afraid of me moving too far away as well. I'm the oldest of 3 children. So it was either Michigan or Michigan State. I was accepted to both. Most of my friends were going to Michigan, so I had to be different. So I went to Michigan State. In addition, I knew that there wasn't going to be a thesis that I would have to write in order to graduate, and that inspired some fear. And so it was Michigan State, and pretty normal. I lived in the dorm for really 4 2/3 years. I was a resident assistant and loved doing that. And also had an influence in my later choice of career.
Mm-hmm. How and when did you decide to become a rabbi?
My mother likes to say that when I was little, I'm not sure if I said I wanted to be God or if I wanted to be a rabbi. But probably not. One would be, a parent could be quite enamored of the other, not so exciting. It sat there for years and really went dormant when, in between my junior and senior years of high school, I went to the Reform Movement's camp, Kutz, K-U-T-Z, Kutz Camp in Warwick, New York. It's the leadership camp. And I went there on a scholarship because I had become the financial vice president of my high school youth group, Temple Israel, Temple Youth. That meant, as the financial vice president, that I ran the 2 fundraisers. A mitzvah day, which where we cleaned up houses and washed windows and raked leaves to make money, and then the Purim Carnival in the spring. But while there, Rabbi Danny Syme, S-Y-M-E, who happened to be the son of my rabbi at home, M. Robert Syme, Danny told his father that he had spotted me and I should become a rabbi, which really surprised me because I felt I was a pretty shy kid. Still got a lot of that introvert in me. He spoke to his father. His father asked to speak to me. We met in his office. He said, "I think you should become a rabbi." I said, "I thank you very much, but no thank you." But it was sort of like putting the little grain of sand in the oyster. And it was that irritant that eventually formed the pearl, to use a Trafe example. It simmered in there for years. I would come home and meet with, all the college kids would get together at Thanksgiving and go, not all, but for me it was all, go to temple, and Rabbi Syme would say, "David, what do you think about this issue?" And I knew I was always being put on the spot. He also identified several others. Many of us have become, in fact, rabbis, although plenty of my close friends did not. Years later, I went through a master's program in industrial relations at the University of Minnesota. I was working in a Jewish town in Rosenberg, Texas. Came home, and Rabbi Syme, it was Rosh Hashanah, gave a sermon on the Akedah, on the binding of Isaac. And he spoke about sacrifice, and we all have what to give. And I ended up in tears. And I thought, this is it. It's time to do this. So I was by then already, that would have been 1984, Rosh Hashanah that year. I was working at Frito-Lay and doing well. Frito-Lay, I was hemming and hawing. Frito-Lay was promoting me and offers of someday, you're now, what would I have been, 26 years old? Some of the time you're 30, you'll be in the home office and you'll be a vice president long before you're 40, maybe the time you're 35.
And what kind of work were you doing at Frito-Lay?
Human resources.
Oh.
And they offered, I had two incredible offers. One was, Frito-Lay said, we'd like you to go to this next plant in Casa Grande, Arizona. You'll be our number 2 in human resources there. And then from there, you'll go to Kern County, California, and be the number 1 as we open up new plants. At the same time, Compaq Computer contacted me. They were only a year old then. This was the spring of 1985, and they said, we'd like you to come work for us. You choose your salary, and you tell us if you want to be in the home office, which was there in Houston, or if you would like to be in a plant. Compaq, C-O-M-P-A-Q. And that's when I had to say to both of those organizations, thank you, but I'm going to go to rabbinical school. Many dropped a jaw. I hadn't even applied. So it was kind of gutsy on my part. When I told my grandmother, my mother's mother, Grandma Smolnik, she looked at me and she wasn't always the sharpest person. The world kind of overwhelmed her, but she looked at me and she said, don't you have a good job? Aren't you making good money? Of course, I nodded yes to each. She said, then why would you want to be a rabbi? She said, it's an aggravation and an obligation. And I smiled and I thought, because I want to make a difference with my life. Be able to look back someday and feel like the world is that much better because I was here and I will have left a legacy.
Oh, that's so nice. So you liked rabbinical school?
I don't know if I'd use those words. It was hard. I had the feeling, it's sort of like when you go to the zoo and you look at the map and you see you are here, and people have worn it out from touching that spot in the map with their finger. The part of my brain that was learning Hebrew was worn out because I felt it was just that one part of me. In the end, I was pleased to become a rabbi. But I remember there was a poster on the wall, teach yourself to say, I do not know, and thou shalt progress. And I thought, that may be true, but not in this room. Not in this classroom. I'm not going to do well saying I do not know. Rabbinical school was a challenge. It wasn't an easy path, and it's that much more striking for me now as I work with rabbinical students. I'm a mentor to a student, and have been with many student rabbis as they visited their pulpits, really trying to be supportive and to let them know there may not be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow does end and life gets better.
And tell us how you found your first position.
So my first position as a rabbi was actually in Glenview, Illinois, like in the northern suburbs of Chicago. There were many positions open. Beth, my wife, Beth and I met in Israel during the first year at the Seder. We met in April. We had our first date in June. I then went to Europe for 2.5 weeks. We had our second date in July. We were engaged by the middle of August. Beth came to the States that November, so she moved to Cincinnati so we could be together. And then, coming out of school, we looked at different communities. Glenview, Glenview, was very attractive because Rabbi Mark Shapiro, Mark Stanley Shapiro, was the senior rabbi. It's Mark with a K, actually. And I knew that I anticipated Mark being a wonderful mentor, and he was. I wouldn't be the rabbi that I am now were it not for Mark. Mm-hmm. It was interesting because later on, the second position, Beth said, all right, I came to Cincinnati, I moved to Chicago, now it's my choice. Let's either go back to Israel or let's look for Seattle.
Aha. And that was a big congregation in Glenview, was it
The
not?
congregation in Glenview was close to, if not more than 1,000 households.
And you were an associate?
I was an assistant and then an associate. I was there for 4 years. After the first 3, and there was a limit of 5 years and out. I knew that going in. And after 2 years, after 3, I'm less sure, they asked if I'd like to continue for the balance, and I said I would, but if there was a congregation that opened up in the Seattle area, I wanted to be able to leave early. And fortunately, something did. Temple Beth Or in Everett was looking for a rabbi. Mm-hmm. And the congregation there was only 65 households. And the position was half-time. It was kind of scary. My favorite color was aqua, which was the color of water. I grew up in Michigan. It wasn't the color of the green of our firs and our cedars and the hemlock, which really has become a favorite color. Everett, I was the first resident rabbi ever in Everett. The congregation, as a reform, the congregation's founding goes back to 1918. It brought in rabbis from, some would say it was really just a lumberjack, from Vancouver to lead high holiday services. Many stories about that. The congregation rebuilt the building with work parties every weekend. Paul Vexler, Vexler, who had been a contractor, would bring in, and a member of the congregation, grew up in Habonim Dror, socialist Zionist, but he believed in work projects. So he would bring in people each weekend, and people to this day will tell you when they go there, you see that framing there? I did that. Oh. You see that wall? I painted that wall. Paul would challenge people to get involved, and in the end, he really built a congregation. I was fortunate enough to step into that, and then working half-time, and that was striking because I would work, first it was half-time, and then three-quarter time, and then 100%, and then the congregation said, we can't afford this. And then I became 90% time. This took place over a few years. I was there for 5 years, from 1993 to 1998. But watch the congregation grow in membership from 65 to have it more than double to 135, while I was there working with wonderful partners. At the same time, it was difficult to, financially make ends meet. So during that first year, I also was going to Bremerton, Washington, to Bet Tikva, also twice a month, 2 Friday nights a month. I was there for 1 year. I was then had the good fortune to become the principal of the community Jewish high school, which was run by the Jewish Federation. And that grew also while I was there. It was 118 kids who were coming, and when I left 2 years later, there were 185 kids enrolled. Over time, I was 93, 94, and then 94, 95 through 96. I also ran the, well, actually in December of 96, so next month it will be 18 years that I've been with the Union for Reform Judaism. Then, of course, it was the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. I began, though, December the 16th, 1996, at 13 hours a month, which is basically 10% time. As they said to me, we'd like you to hold up the flag occasionally. But the region was growing. There were then 21 congregations. And when when the region was dissolved in 2009, there were 35 congregations. So helped that grow as well. 1996.
Yeah.
Right. To 2009. We'll get that later.
Yeah,
all the
we'll get
details
that
later.
Right.
Um,
Don't worry about mine.
so first when I first joined in 96, I was actually the assistant director, and the director was in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. So you were the assistant director of was it the Pacific Northwest region of the UAHC?
So we were actually then called the Pacific Northwest Council, and it was kind of it was really a subset of the Pacific, what was then called the Pacific Central West. There was Northwest, Central West, and Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
Several years later, in the year 2000, they split us off and we became independent. Excuse me, I don't know if that's correct. That's not true. I finally had one full-time job in 2000. That's what it was. We split off as a region probably in 1998. But then I was the half-time regional director. Mm-hmm. And at that time, I was also the director of the Florence Melton Adult Mini School, also an adult education program of the Federation. So during those years, I had 2 and 3 jobs at a time, and I always owed somebody time, whether it was my family or one of these positions. And that was quite a challenge.
Yes. Sounds like it. And then when it became full-time, did you still have other things going?
No, well, other things, but thank God I could just have one job. Mm-hmm. It was so nice.
Yeah.
And that again in the year 2000, and it meant that I could really devote myself to growing the region and working on projects.
Could you give the parameters of the region?
Geographic?
Yes, please.
So the region, it's funny. Nancy, thank you for asking. I haven't been asked that in a number of years. My kids would always make fun of me because I'll probably do it today, give it with hand motions. So it was Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana.
Okay.
And we realized that to go from one end to the other, whether from Billings to Fairbanks or Ashland, Oregon to Fairbanks, was the same distance as traveling if we went west to east all the way to the East Coast.
Wow.
And there was the last year of that position from 2008 and 2009, the union was experimenting with how could we serve congregations differently? And at that point, 3 of us, 2 in Los Angeles and myself, divided up the congregations,
Just keep going.
divided up those congregations that were in the Pacific Central West. So I had that many more congregations, including Honolulu, Hawaii.
Okay, and maybe I'm going to turn off the tape for a second. We're back after a brief interlude there, and David Fine was just explaining about the geography of the UAHC, this redistribution.
It was. What was striking, though, is this was a time of growth for congregations. People would be amazed to know that the Reform movement has had 6 congregations in Montana, 4 in Alaska. And as Jews actually were leaving the Rust Belt and the East Coast, they were coming west. And they were eager to be a part of this larger movement that really had a lot to offer and still does. It's my bias, but I believe it.
Very interesting. And now I think, so under your leadership, the growth and expansion of the region nearly doubled.
It's true, certainly in numbers. For many years, I mean, there was Congregation Beth Israel in Portland. It was really the granddaddy of Reformed congregations. I'll bet they're close to 150 years old. And in Seattle, of course, it's Temple to Her Sinai. I want to say we're now about 110 years. I think it was 1904 or so. As the region grew, it wanted to, well, do what other parts of the country have done. For many years, the kids here would either go to Camp Swig, or for those who know it for a long time, Camp Saratoga, which was in close to Los Gatos, California. I can't think of the city. It's not right in the tip of my tongue. The desire was, could there be a camp in the Pacific Northwest? During the mid-1990s, there was a move to establish a camp. Joe Schuster, Alava Shalom, from Temple B'nai Torah, really was at the head of that movement, brought many people together. Rabbi Alan Smith, again, Smitty came out. We met at what was then the former site of Temple Sinai in Bellevue. And Smitty looked around, counted up the numbers of people in our congregations and said, sorry, not enough people. We can't do it. There aren't enough kids in religious school. Financially, it's not feasible. And that's how it sat for 4 or 5 years.
So you're going to tell us about Camp Kalsman now.
Well, that was the group. The Kalsmans had not come forward with incredible generosity. Fast forward, actually, the year was 2000. Peachy and Red Kalsman then live in California. Through connections that they make, including those with through their daughter Peachy. Oh, excuse me, it's not Peachy and Red. Excuse me. I've got the name wrong, and it's Lee and Red Kalsman. Excuse me. Peachy is their daughter. Peachy and her husband Mark have been very involved in the Reform movement in Los Angeles. Peachy and Mark have gotten to become good friends with Rabbi Lenny, L-E-N-N-Y, Lenny Thal. Lenny, as it turns out, is from Bellingham, Washington. Lenny had been the regional director for the Reform movement for many years. Actually, before that, he had been, I believe, the dean of students at HUC in LA. He becomes the regional director, works closely with Mark and Peachy. Red Kalsman is in the hospital. He is visited by an HUC student and is very taken with the pastoral care that he receives. Also sees that it's time to think about his legacy. Speaks with Mark and Peachy, and among the causes to which they would like to make their legacy are health and healing and Jewish camping. From these conversations, $5 million is designated to become the lead gift for a future camp in the Pacific Northwest. This is incredibly generous. I should mention as well that Mark and Peachy have 3 children. One of those children is an adult with 2 sons of her own. Janny Levy Pauli, and Janny and her husband Bill and their 2 sons, Jeremy and Jacob, live on Bainbridge Island. This gift, though, sets into motion a search for suitable land for a summer camp for young Jews. When they ask Lenny Thal where could that money best be used, Lenny thinks about the Pacific Northwest. I had been brought on staff. I became the point person. I was now looking at commercial real estate. What kind of properties could we find that needed to be anywhere larger than 15 acres, where we could develop a camp for $5 million. In the end, $5 million allowed us to get started, but it wasn't enough for a camp. We always saw the cost rising as it became real. I looked at 35 different sites. The parameters were that it would be within 2 hours of 2 hours of SeaTac Airport. That it had a water feature, that is a river or a lake. And as I quickly learned, we had to be able to have access to water. Water is very precious in the Pacific Northwest. Would whatever we build, would there be a well? Would there be a city source? So land alone wasn't going to do it. I looked at sites as far south as McMinnville, Oregon. There was actually a horse farm. East toward Yakima. North, we really seriously considered a property at Baker Lake. That property was, actually we did some research on it. The problem was City Power and Light had a dam on the lake, and if need be, they were allowed to flood the land nearby. That would have been a problem.
Yeah.
So Smitty turned to me and said, all right, David, it's your job to find this land. I wasn't trained in finding land in rabbinical school nor anywhere else in my background. Smitty's comment was, don't worry, you'll know you're there when you find it. We looked seriously at a property in Granite Falls, I want to say on Menzel Lake Road. The property was gorgeous. It was on the property was the first sawmill in the county, The owners of the land showed me I have a copy. I mean, if I find it, I can share it. It was a land grant. Somebody granted them 40 acres. And there it was in Snohomish County. The problem was because of floodplain restriction, what had been 90 acres was less than 15 acres of usable and buildable land. However, we did find our caretaker, Randy Parsons, who was caretaking for that property. I need to give Smitty full credit. He quietly said, David, this guy is wonderful. Ask him if when we find our property, if he will become our caretaker. And he did, and Randy was wonderful. We were proceeding with negotiations, actually, with a property, Camp Baracha, but they called it Baraka because they couldn't pronounce the ch, the chaf. They spelled their camp Berachah in Black Diamond, Washington. We found them through Grant Weed and others who we knew were land specialists. They're attorneys. The interesting thing about Camp Baracha, it was a camp that was fully built out. They were seeking to buy a second camp for themselves. The thought was that we would share the property and share the camp for several years while they built. It looked ideal because it met their interests and ours. The challenge, therefore, we could build up our population each summer as they moved out. The camp had a go-kart track. It had horses. It actually had kind of a hotel right on the site, in addition to cabins for kids. It had a pool that had been outdoors and was now covered. One of the challenges was this community was, to put it mildly, conservative religiously. They were a Christian camp, and we basically agreed not to talk about certain topics with each other. How conservative was it? The girls were not allowed, the girls in the pool needed to have shirts on over their bathing suits, lest they become too revealing. We were actually, and while this was happening, we kept up our search for land. I had visited, well, the first site I visited, I should mention, was next to Camp Waskowitz in North Bend, Washington. Temple Deher Sinai had rented out the space for their Camp for Living Judaism. Part of the reason we knew that there was a market is that Camp Waskowitz was filled to capacity every summer with kids from Temple Deher Sinai. B'nai Torah decided they were going to run a summer camp, and they also rented space from Camp Waskowitz. The director of Camp Waskowitz, Roberta McFarland, was enormously helpful. She actually went out with me to the first couple of sites that I visited. But somebody who was Jewishly would say mishpacha to their cook, owned property adjacent to Camp Waskowitz. We checked it out. It was beautiful. The price was good, but it was built on a mountain. And you can't play soccer on a mountain. And there was no natural water feature. We also considered building next to Camp Brotherhood. They really wanted us to come there. That was part of the goal. For Brotherhood was to have a camp for Christians and Jews. But again, there wasn't a water feature, and the property we would have bought was occupied by people who were, I think it would have been a legal challenge, besides actually it might have been a physical challenge to get them off the land. We also at one point looked at Camp Solomon Schechter, who wanted to create a campus of camps, and we thought that that really wasn't going to work. They had a water feature and they had the land. So we had seen...
And is that in Olympia?
It is in Olympia. We had seen this property that became Camp Kalsman. It was then occupied, people were living on it. It was the Love Israel community. Now, some would call it a commune, others would call it a cult. I'll leave that off the table for now. The Love Israel family the name came from the words love is real.
Oh.
Their legal name, and I have their charter, is the Church of Jesus Christ at Armageddon. Formerly on Queen Anne, they had moved to the site in Arlington, just outside of Arlington, in the early 80s, 82 or 83. Technically, that area is called Jordan Village. There was a community there in the 1800s. There's actually a Jordan cemetery as one drives up, what else? Jordan River Road, which is one of the ways of going. Well, one has to drive it, but Jordan is just south of the camp. The Israel family was bankrupt. They were headed for legal proceedings in bankruptcy court that took place in Seattle. I was actually at the court. Smitty heard this and said, unfortunately, it's just a matter of time. The asking price they wanted for the property was too high for us. I think they wanted $5 or $6 million. It was just richer than what we could afford. There were 18 parcels at the camp. 16 were held on to by the Love Israel family, 2 by a member of that group. Part of the problem was some of those parcels were in foreclosure, others were not. In addition, there are close to 300 acres, 298 acres at Camp Kalsman. There's a flat area and a sloped, there's actually a mountain on the site. As it got closer to the bankruptcy court, which took place in December of 2003, the last weeks of December, the banks, there were several people who had secured loans who could stop a deal from going through. The bankruptcy judge appointed Max Lohn, L-O-H-N.
Excuse me just a second.
We could see, as the countdown was headed towards bankruptcy court, the Love Israel family had hoped to put the land up for sale. They even parceled it out, hoping that people would buy vacation spots. But they were not successful. As it got to bankruptcy court, the judge appointed Max Lohn, who happened to be Jewish, to see if he could find a worthwhile financial agreement. We went to visit the camp, Smitty and Lenny Thal and I, with Max Lohn, and decided we actually could make a deal. So we left the camp and went into the parking lot. I think it's called Forest Village. It's in, it's not Snohomish. It's the largest lake in Snohomish County, and I'm losing the name of it right now. But we met in the parking lot and worked out a deal. Here's what we could present to the judge. But it turns out that things could not go through until the bankruptcy judge cleared it, and there were, again, several people who had secured loans. 2 were banks, and they agreed for a certain amount on the dollar.
What
The-
does that mean?
So if I have a secured loan, it means that you've written me and saying it's like a lien on your car.
Ah,
I have ownership. Any deal you make on it, I have something to say. There was one person who had loaned Love Israel, or really given, but he was a loan, $90,000. It was the inheritance when his parents had died. Love took him in. He had since left the commune. He was living up in the Okanagan, the far corner of the state of Washington. He then wrote a letter to me telling me that he was owed money. The Love Israel owed him money. I called him. Turns out he was living in a cabin. This was not somebody this was all the money that he had. And he said to me, "What should I do? Love has offered me $30,000 from the proceeds of the sale. If I take it, I'm going to lose $60,000. I gave Love $90,000. And he asked me what he should do. And I knew that if this wasn't resolved, the judge was going to put the land up for auction. I had to say to this guy, if you accept it, you will have $30,000. There are many people who have loaned greater sums of money who are going to get nothing. He accepted it, and that allowed the deal to go forward, and that meant that the Union of American Hebrew Congregations could buy the land.
wow.
But it came right down to the wire. Actually, there were 2 court dates, and it was approaching the end of the year, and the banks did not want to have this go into the next year, into 2004. So in late December 2003, we became the purchasers of the land. The Israels were still living on the land, and they were kind of in some ways regular folks, and in many ways not. Each one had a virtue name given by Love. So if Love had a dream, or if you had a dream, Love would then designate your new name. So there were people by the names of Love, and Sirius, and Noble, and One, W-O-N, and Honesty, and Amishadai, and a whole list of names, some biblical, some based on virtue. Then we had to make arrangements for the Israels to leave the land. Smitty quite wisely said, if you clean it up and get it in good shape, you will then get your full share of the money. If you leave it trashed, you're not going to get it. But there were trailers on the site, and at one point, there was a bus that had been backed into a hill. They were hoping to make a root cellar out of it, only it didn't work so well. So now there was a bus, half buried by dirt and covered by blackberries. There were old car batteries. There were all kinds of trash. There was a giant barn. Many of the images that we see from those days are of a giant barn that the sanctuary, which was attached to Love's bedroom, was right upstairs on the barn. And a whole warren of rooms that went, again, in this main building. Because it wasn't earthquake safe, that building, and it would be very expensive to retrofit, that building was taken down. It was quite something building the camp. There are still the maintenance building and an adult retreat center still exist from the days of the Israels.
Oh.
They were builders and hoped to make money doing building. There's also a house immediately north across the street built by the Israels. Questions? I'll stop there, though.
Wow. And so sometime in the negotiations, well, once they happened, you got your caretaker, Randy Parsons.
So we did. It's interesting because so Camp Bracha, we had to say to them, it was close to signing. We were very close to signing a deal with them. You know, we're very sorry, but we're not going to go through with this. We need to reimburse you for your losses so that you're made whole. And they were very generous. It was in the thousands of dollars. It was not a huge amount. Randy Parsons came and became the caretaker. He occupied the camp beginning, I want to say, in April of 2003.
2004?
I'm sorry, thank you very much, 2004. And then it became, we were raising money. And then at first it was raising money for air because we didn't have a camp. It was only an idea of a camp. The question for the local congregations, for De Hirsch and B'nai Torah, was, when will this camp be built? Will it be the summer of 2005, 2006? In the end, we had hoped for 2006 between permitting and building costs and bidding it out. It wasn't real. So we ran Camp Atid, A-T-I-D, Atid means future, at Camp Waskowitz. But it was run by the Union for Reform Judaism. It might have been the Union of American Hebrew Congregations at that time. Interestingly enough, what added to the cost of building the camp? Katrina. Why? Laborers and plywood were all going to Louisiana. So that in the middle of everything, as the camp was being built in 2006. The camp had its first summer in 2007. We had 90 camper beds. This summer, there are 240 camper beds. It's been a wonderful process of filling the camp. It's been just great. And it's great to talk with kids everywhere who say, I was just this past weekend in Burnaby, British Columbia. One girl said, I love camp. Of course, she said to her parents, and I'm going back next summer. And that's the way it's been across the region. And it's a gorgeous, gorgeous site.
Great. Once you'd bought the property, you had to bring in people to design it and that kind of thing. Were you able to, was this still your prime responsibility?
For me? Mm-hmm. So I think part of what has characterized my work at the Union for Reform Judaism is I've always been involved in 3 or 4 big projects at a time. So no, there was no camp director, but that was what I was doing. In addition, I was working to grow the region and to work, really not just grow the region, but really to strengthen those congregations in the region. Deal with conflicts, help strengthen boards, and make life good for the Jews. Mm-hmm.
So did somebody you hired a director then?
So the director arrived, I know the date well, on October the 16th of October the 16th, 2006. How do I know that so well? That was my 50th birthday.
Oh.
And David Berkman was hired to become the director.
And that's B-E-R-K.
M-A-N, right.
Okay.
And David is the director to this day. He had been the assistant and associate director at several URJ camps, and he was the assistant director of camping for the entire movement when he was hired.
Wonderful. Is there anything else you want to say about Camp Kalsman before we move on to another question?
Only that for me, I visit the campsite and I see the ghosts. I think there was a yurt over here. And this is where, between these filbert trees, this is where Hiram lived in a bus. And where the dining hall is, that was an enormous greenhouse. So I see those kind of things. I look at the lake, and we call it, there's an island on the lake now. Well, there wasn't always an island. Love enjoyed using a backhoe, and so he cut out the backside of the lake to turn it into a lake that would have an island. There are, I guess I know all those stories, working with Love and with Sirius, who was the number 2. And it's just very striking to me to think that at one point there was actually a large, I don't know what to call it, a big hole that had been dug out, kind of a conical shaped, and it had a plastic liner in it because Love had built a pool for himself there. But there were all kinds of, again, things of interest from the site.
Wow. Wow. A lot of memories for you.
So there's one more. There's a knoll that's actually protruding bedrock. I was walking and for the Love Israel family, that was the place that was to be one of silence. If 2 people were having a dispute, they would walk up on the knoll together and just be quiet together. As I was explaining this to my brother-in-law, he took a look at the hill, and he said, "Aren't these all going to be Jews?" I said, "Well, yes." He said, "How about no interrupting hill?"
Cute. Very cute. Your current title is Rabbinic Director of the Small Congregations Network of the URJ. What does that entail, and how do you do it, being based in Washington State?
That's a very good question. So, most of my time is spent on the phone, whether it's a cell phone or voice over internet. And I work with congregations across North America. I also travel a great deal. This year, I hit gold flyer status with Alaska Airlines in July. So,
How many miles is that?
it takes, I'm forgetting, it's 40, I think it's 50,000 miles.
Wow.
But they're just flying buses. So what it entails is helping, doing my best to strengthen congregations, to help them to become better at being themselves. In addition, I work with new congregations, trying to bring them into the union and helping them to grow. And I also work with, at one point my business card said congregations in transition, which was a euphemism for many things. Often it's places that are in trouble. I now also work with congregations that are looking to merge with each other or to find alternatives to merging with each other. So the good news is I'm busy. The bad news is I'm busy.
Yes, it sounds like a lot to keep juggling.
That's true.
What other organizations and or interests do you have? And any awards that you have received over the years?
I think the 2 awards that I am most proud of, I'm a lifetime member of Nifty Chicago. And just pleased to have been recognized by the teens, having been the rabbinic advisor for 3 years while I was at the congregation in the Chicago area. This past year, I received an honorary doctorate from Hebrew Union College. Lest you be too impressed by that, any of those of us who were ordained after 25 years, if we're still involved in the active rabbinate, receive that doctorate.
Interesting.
But it was still very powerful, though, and I would say somewhat redemptive to go back to Cincinnati with many of those same professors and to be treated, I don't know if respect is the right word, but almost as with recognition of, it's nice to have you making a difference in the Jewish world. And that was really a delight. Interest, I think, outside of the Jewish world, I've really, I wear my fleece proudly. I hike. I still swim, though not as often as I would like to. I kayak. I bicycle. I snowshoe. I skate ski. I like spending time outdoors. As much as I like spending time with people, it's a good way also to balance that.
Oh, yes. Yes. I wanted to follow up on something you said early on, that you met Beth. Oh, well, let's go on to the next question
All right,
because it
sure.
relates to that. Would you please talk about your family, including what Beth was doing in Israel when you met her?
So Beth had made Aliyah when I met her in April of 1985. I am the third generation where the husband has brought the wife from Israel back to the States. My in-laws, Morty and Chaya Burstein, met each other in Shomer HaTzair. They were part of the Garin, part of the starting seed for Kibbutz Sasa in 1948. And they have many a story to tell. But after less than a year and a half on the kibbutz, they came back to the States so my father-in-law could get his education with the GI Bill. And they stayed in the States until 1985, when they moved to Israel to start another mitzpeh, an outlook settlement within the Green Line near Carmiel. So at that Seder, Beth announced that her parents were moving to Israel, only that 7 months later, Beth had moved back to the States. So it pained me, and Beth's grandparents had hoped also to move to Israel. World War I broke out. It sounds like such a passive way of saying it. Her grandfather went to Palestine. The Turks kicked him out. He then went to the States, and her grandmother didn't get to go to Israel until much later in her life, and it wasn't the easier transition that it would have been had she gone in the teens. So that's how Beth and I met, was at that Seder. She had been a social worker working for the city of Jerusalem, and at that point actually was working for Young Judea Year Course in Jerusalem. Again, the Zionist family. Striking that my son, who's now, actually turns 27 this week, also developed that love for Israel. He also went to Israel for a gap year after high school. He also went back for a year in Israel after college. Interestingly enough, he has Israeli citizenship and came, so close to, he was drafted by the Israeli army. And that's a longer story as to how he had to make the case that he was actually an American on an American program. But he has Israeli citizenship and an Israeli passport. Our daughter, so he is now
And his
actually...
name?
I'm sorry, he is Avi, or Avishai, Avishai. And our daughter Naomi Meira, Meira, though she chooses not to use her middle name, who is 24. Naomi lives here in Seattle. I am very proud of both of them. She also has spent a great deal of time in Israel. They both went to the same undergraduate school, to Carleton College in Minnesota. And as I like to say, it was wonderful not only that they got to be with each other and strengthen their relationship as brother and sister, but I saved a lot of money on t-shirts and sweatshirts.
Great. And you had said that he is in the first year of rabbinical school.
He is also at Hebrew Union College, the full name, Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, with his first year in Jerusalem, and next year, actually the following 4 years, will be in Los Angeles.
Oh, mm-hmm. Well, that's nice to be on the same coast.
It is, and it makes it very easy with frequent flyer miles.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about your family?
Oh, that I love them dearly.
Oh, good.
And I have been very fortunate and very blessed to have them. Truly blessed.
David, what advice would you give to young people growing up today?
This is a dangerous question. Here I am, age 58, and all right, tell everybody else what they should do. What I think, though, is, it's a wonderful open-ended question, though. I think I'm recognizing that we live in an age that I'll call the New Enlightenment. People have increased access to information. That is wonderful. But I think the internet mentality has been, I want what I want, when I want it, how I want it, and I want it for free. So it's certainly been a challenge, I think, for religious institutions. But what does that mean for individuals? I encourage people to, I'm going to speak more to Jews as a rabbi, look for the meaning in Judaism. Look for how it can enrich your life. Look for how these texts, these ancient texts, these rabbinic texts, are both ancient and timely and timeless. It isn't about observance, again, as much as it is about meaning and answering life's great questions. There's a temptation to reject outright just because. And I would discourage that in the same way I would discourage just saying accept all those texts because they've been around. But investigate, look deeply, and you'll find the richness in them, much beyond what's at the surface. The only other advice I probably give my own children, but others, are, while one can live a life with an interest, with an orientation towards self, devote yourself to the common good. And again, I have confidence in my own children and where they are in life, professionally and personally. But there's that greater good. I think that community organizing has it right, even though many would like to cast aspersions on it. Wow. I do mean
Yeah.
that.
That was very interesting. Would you like to speak about anything else?
Well, I'm going to go back to the last question for a second, and that is your sense of humor will take you far. I see that again in my own kids, but it's really, the world's a serious enough place. Let's take a break for a second.
What an excellent interview this has been. You've told us so much about your life and about Camp Carlsman, and you've had good advice at the end, and I so appreciate your being here to give us all this information.
Thank you, Nancy. It's really a joy and it's an honor. And it's hard to believe that after 21 years, this has really become home. I think that home is, if you would have died yesterday, where would you be buried? And I feel like this is home, and I'm glad to have been a part of this conversation. I hope that though no one may know my name, part of conversations that continue long into the future.
Thank you again.